Welcome back to Inside Coverage. I'm joined by ESPN senior writer, author of the soon-to-be-released American Kings, a biography of the quarterback, Seth Wickersham. Full disclosure, the first time I ever got to talk to Seth, I was just a little podcast trying to make it, and Seth gave me time. So, man, I'm excited to talk to you now. It's almost a decade later, just about your book and about the NFL. So let's start with the NFL, because you just wrote a book about quarterbacks. We've talked a lot about Anthony Richardson and the Colts. They insist they're not trading him. What does development look like for a quarterback like Anthony Richardson?
Well, first, yeah, I mean, it's hard to believe it's been a decade, but it's always great to see you and talk to you and hear your voice and, have the chance to talk ball with you. Anthony Richardson, I think that there's a complicated and layered question to that. I think that number one, I think that it's obvious he isn't ready. I think that like the way that you saw him getting lit up a bit in the preseason when it's not exactly, the defenses that are, that mostly it's vanilla fronts that they're facing. And he still wasn't ready for it. I think, it was clear. And I think that the locker room probably knew that Daniel Jones is the best option there. That said, I kind of like that Ballard, I don't see Anthony Richardson going anywhere. I think that I know that his agent came out and said there were trust issues. I mean, I don't think Chris Ballard probably cares too much about them if there actually are trust issues, because they've got a quarterback who they, think can still be a really good player on a rookie contract, and they want to invest in him. And, I think that the agent coming out and saying what he did probably didn't do Anthony Richardson any more favors in the locker room. But we forget that the NFL is a developmental league, and Anthony Richardson hasn't had the best chance to develop. Some of it's his fault, some of it's not. But I think that there's an entire economy of quarterbacks. Richardson doesn't exactly fit this class, but there's an entire economy of quarterbacks nowadays, like Geno Smith, like Sam Darnold, like Baker Mayfield to an extent, who get picked into kind of tough situations. And situations where a lot of quarterbacks don't do well. And if they're just able to hang on and survive and find someone who believes in them and is willing to kind of take a hard look at themselves and understand what they need to do to get better, there's an entire second chance economy for these guys out there. And it wouldn't surprise me if maybe next year someone like Will Levis, if his shoulder gets better, if he ends up being one of those guys. And who knows down the road if Anthony Richardson could be one of those guys too.
It's interesting, though, the way you say that, because it has me thinking about whether or not development even exists anymore. It's not that long ago that everybody was convinced Josh Allen would never become a great quarterback. He obviously has. That's the exception to the rule. Does the league still focus on development of young quarterbacks?
It's rare. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, look, there are very few good and great quarterbacks in the NFL, and there are very few good and great coaches in the NFL. And a lot of the coaches who aren't good or great, who are neither good or great, I should say, end up being, picking early and being on a faster clock and less patient. And, I think we've also seen some guys come into the league, CJ Stroud, obviously, who come in and Jaden Daniels, who have these phenomenal years. And it's well, why can't that be our guy? And, it doesn't work that way. And I think that, like I said, I think Chris Ballard, he's been there a long time, doesn't have exactly, the best record to stand on. And I don't think that he's going to trade Anthony Richardson just to appease Anthony. I think that look, he bet a large part of his career on this guy, and he's going to let this thing play out a little bit. So it's a little bit of a different situation, but, I think that the important thing, obviously, for a lot of these guys is to find the situation that helps them develop the most. I mean, again, you just see teams like the Jets and the Browns and the Titans and the Jets. Did we say the Jets? Who end up cycling through really good, potentially quarterbacks who are really good because they're just not a good organization.
Doesn't that make the what ifs just sort of impossible. Like I
Yeah.
think back to Bears fans that constantly say, well, what if we drafted
Mhm.
Mahomes? And it's like, okay, well, you wouldn't have had Andy Reid and you wouldn't have had Alex Smith teaching him how to be a pro. Like you probably wouldn't have brought him along the same way. You wouldn't have developed him. Like it makes so much of the success of young quarterbacks feels like circumstance has to be a bigger factor in our conversation.
Totally. Context matters. Like we like to think that it doesn't because we just want to believe that every guy coming out is John Elway, but context matters. And I think that some of the news from my book came out in the spring about Carl and Caleb Williams, deliberating about whether Chicago was the best place for him to land. And, did they have a power play to get out of the Bears drafting them and, enable them to have that kind of basic privilege of picking, having some agency over your future employer. And obviously, I think at the end of the day, Caleb was inspired by some of the teammates that he was going to have on the Bears. He wanted to give it a shot. He liked Chicago. And, his options were tough. The option was to make it an untenable situation and blow up the city of Chicago. And as he told me, I wasn't ready to blow up the city. And, but we do forget about this. I mean, we should know better by now. You look at someone like Alex Smith and the number of offensive coordinators he had in his run in San Francisco before Jim Harbaugh got there and kind of was able to help him settle into being a good player. Again, it's just like we quarterbacks are such an instrument of hope. And it's easy to forget that even though they are a big, big part of things, they are not able to do it alone. And we talk a lot about is such and such a system quarterback? It's it's kind of a negative connotation when every quarterback is a system quarterback. Joe Montana was a system quarterback. Look at John Elway's statistics under Dan Reeves and everyone else. He was a system quarterback, and system and coaching simply matters.
That's interesting because it has me thinking about some of the holdout hold-ins we've seen. Terry McLaurin, Rashee Rice in a much different way, going to be suspended for the first 6 games. When you talk about the entire system, how much does continuity with a great wide receiver matter to the development of quarterbacks in the modern NFL?
I mean, I think it matters a lot. And I also think that it can be dangerous because you don't want to be predictable, and I think that even though Bill Belichick's record drafting pass catchers, well, I want to say receivers in specific, during his time in New England often wasn't great. I think that he was really kind of onto something in the sense that you can take pieces and, if you have a great quarterback, he can cover up, some mistakes for a while, and it eventually everyone will get on the same page. And the fact is that it's easier to play quarterback than ever before, and it's easier to play receiver than ever before. And so while everybody kind of talks about having that number one target, I think that the main thing is, can you find a guy who can get open and catch the ball? And, not everybody has to be McLaurin or that type of dynamic skill player. I think that you can do a lot with, maybe receivers that aren't superstars.
So let's talk a little bit about Arch because it feels like this is the week. Everybody has an Arch opinion going into this weekend. Obviously, big game. Considering what you've learned about him and some writing that you've done on him, what type of NFL environment do you look at and say, yeah, this is where Arch could really be successful?
Man, I mean, so in the book, I obviously used Arch as a way to talk about the entire Manning family. And I also, went into the ruthless recruiting of him. I think that it had to have been the most hotly contested recruiting environment maybe ever for one player, given how the college space has changed. I mean, we're projecting a lot with Arch. Let's just be honest. And I think that one of the things that I think is going to be really difficult is that, college football is no longer a game that really prepares quarterbacks for the NFL. You can't trust statistics. I mean, Bailey Zappi has the record for most touchdown passes in the season at 62 in college. You can barely hang on in the NFL. I think that around the turn of the century, guys like Mike Leach and Hal Mumme, and there were some other coaches, really figured out a way to exploit the spacing on the college field and the hash marks being different than the NFL. And so the fact is that the windows are bigger. Defenses can't disguise coverages as much as they can in the NFL. And the college game is largely played on the outside. And in the NFL, the passing game is largely played on the inside. And I think that like that's one of the hardest things for quarterbacks to transition to, is that not only guys are bigger and faster and stronger and smarter in a lot of ways, but they can get around. You have to be able to throw over the middle. And I think that like, even though I think Caleb Williams had a pretty good rookie year, all things considered, the coaching staff there was frustrated at times that like he wouldn't pull the trigger over the middle to open receivers. And so all this is a long way of saying that like, even if Arch has a great year, and he very well might, I still don't know how predictive it is for, what, his NFL ceiling will be. I mean, I think that like, he just has a lot of football to play before we get there. And then even so, I think that, you have to look at like things beyond statistics and, almost beyond film in some cases and look at like, how he manages things, how quickly he processes, how he deals with fame. Those things are huge questions for quarterbacks. And, I think the college games can answer them for some of them and not for others.
Your book is American Kings, a biography of the quarterback. It comes out September 9th. Tell everybody what to expect from it.
Man, it's the biography of a quarterback is kind of a funny, subtitle, but that's what I tried to do. I mean, I tried to write this book for anyone who's ever played quarterback, who's ever thought about it, who's ever mythologized it. I wanted to write about guys who played in the past and people who played in the present, and write about, the glories and the dangers and how this very odd job became such a celebrated place in America. So I've got a lot of big names in the book that fans will recognize, and also some names that I think they'll learn about. But, I just did my best to try to show what it's like throughout history and now at every stage, from high school to college to retired Hall of Famer.
Yeah, I've got your work on my bookshelf for a reason. One of the best to do it in the entire business. Seth, I appreciate your time, man. Thanks for hanging out with me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, man. Great to see you as always.
More inside coverage coming at you after we take a quick break.